The bells of San Marco rang louder than usual that morning. Not from celebration, but because Florence was trembling. Not from war or plague, but from the voice of a man cloaked in black and fury. Girolamo Savonarola wasn't born to command cities. He was small, sharp-featured, with hollow cheeks and eyes that never rested. A failed physician from Ferrara, he had once wandered monasteries in obscurity, plagued by visions he could not understand. But now, standing atop the pulpit of Florence's most powerful churches, he unleashed sermons that struck the wealthy like plagues and turned noble women into weeping penitents. The year was 1494, and Florence was rotting in its own beauty. The Medici, a dynasty of merchants turned monarchs, had built a city dripping in gold and decadence. Botticelli's canvases lined the halls. Platonic ideals mingled with pagan symbols. Wealth flowed from every marble arch, and Savonarola called it all filth. He didn't speak in measured tones or gentle metaphors. He thundered of hellfire and antichrist. He prophesied invasion, pestilence, and divine judgment. "Behold," he cried, "the sword of the Lord hangs over Florence." Then, as if conjured by his words, it arrived. The French, led by the young and ruthless Charles VIII, invaded Italy, their cannons shattering the peninsula's fragile balance. The Medici, long despised for their corruption and cowardice, fled in the chaos. In the power vacuum, Savonarola stepped forward, not with armies, but with visions. He claimed Florence had been chosen by God to be the New Jerusalem, a beacon of purity in a sinful world. He wasn't merely a preacher, he was a prophet, and the people believed him. Renaissance artists burned their mythological works in public. Women stripped off fine jewelry. Merchants pledged to end usury. For a moment, Florence became a city transformed not by politics, but by prophecy. But something darker stirred beneath the repentance. Savonarola began organizing children into patrols, small boys in white robes who knocked on doors and demanded sinful objects, dice paintings, perfumes, mirrors. These were delivered to public pyres and burned under chants of glory to God. This was not mere revival, it was the foundation of a theocracy. His sermons stopped being warnings and became commands. He dictated dress codes, silenced taverns, and policed thought through confession. Behind the scenes, his visions grew stranger. He claimed the Virgin Mary had appeared to him delivering secret messages. He said he no longer read the Bible, he absorbed it directly through divine light. His followers, called the Piagnoni or Weepers, began to whisper that Savonarola was the new Elijah. And then the dreams started. Eyewitnesses recorded that Savonarola would sometimes collapse after sermons, muttering strange tongues or shaking as if seized. Once in front of stunned monks, he stood motionless for hours, claiming the Lord was speaking directly to his heart. Florence watched, awed, terrified, enraptured. But not everyone bowed. In secret salons and political circles, enemies began to stir. Some were humanists appalled by his anti-intellectual tirades. Others were merchants watching their profits vanish under his moral economy. A few were Medici loyalists waiting for their revenge. But the most dangerous adversary was far away in Rome. Pope Alexander II, the infamous Borgia, had watched Savonarola's rise with growing unease. The friar did not merely criticize corruption, he declared the entire Vatican illegitimate. He refused to travel to Rome when summoned. He called Alexander a devil in a tiara. And Rome does not forget such insults. But for now in Florence, the prophet stood untouchable. Savonarola had lit a fire that consumed not just vanities, but certainties. The Renaissance had celebrated man's glory. He reminded them of man's damnation. And though the city glowed with holy fervor, a question lingered beneath every sermon. How long could a city survive when ruled by the voice of a man who believed himself the mouthpiece of God? The chill of Lent settled over Florence, but the streets burned with a new kind of fire. On the Piazza della Signoria, crowds gathered not for festivals or tournaments, but for ritual purges. The flames rose not for meat or merriment, but for sin. It was February 7th, 1497, the first great bonfire of the Vanities. At Savonarola's urging, children scoured the city like holy scavengers. They knocked on doors and stormed homes. These were no mere schoolboys, they were compagnacci, the little companions acting with the force of moral law. In return for praises and small coins, citizens surrendered their mirrors, playing cards, silken gowns, musical instruments, erotic art, even copies of Dante. All of it was thrown onto a mountainous wooden pyre in the city center, crowned by a grotesque effigy of the devil himself. A horned, leering figure draped in crimson robes, said to resemble a cardinal. Botticelli, once a court painter of myth and pleasure, quietly delivered several of his works to be burned. Historians still debate which ones. Above it all stood Savonarola, arms raised in dark ecstasy. He wasn't simply condemning luxury, he was erasing it. To many Florentines, this was exhilarating. The rich were humbled, the poor were empowered. The city seemed cleansed, almost reborn. But beneath the surface, something else festered terror. Artists feared to paint. Scholars feared to speak. Even laughter was suspect. Taverns were shuttered songs. Banned festivals abolished. Savonarola's sermons, once uplifting, turned to wrath. He spoke now of Florence as a chosen vessel, but one that could be smashed by God if disobedient. And slowly the line between religion and surveillance began to disappear. People denounced neighbors for gambling, adultery, or impure thoughts. In convents, nuns wept during confession, afraid their silence would brand them heretics. Children turned in their own fathers for owning blasphemous books. Savonarola's power was not institutional, it was emotional. He didn't need soldiers, he had fear. Yet for all his asceticism, the friar maneuvered politically with sharp precision. He inserted allies into the Signoria Florence's ruling council. He had enemies exiled. He wrote the new city constitution himself, framing Florence as a Christian republic under God's direct law. And above all, he insisted that no man, not merchant, noble, or even pope, stood above divine authority. This last belief would be his undoing. In Rome, Pope Alexander VI grew increasingly furious. He had tolerated much the insults, the refusal to appear, the slanders. But now Savonarola was declaring Florence independent of papal control, setting a precedent that could unravel the Church's grip across Europe. The Pope's counterstrike began with letters' formal rebukes, accusing Savonarola of arrogance and heresy. The friar read them aloud in the pulpit, and laughed. "Rome is drunk with the blood of saints," he cried, "but Florence is the light of God's new covenant." Next came threats. Excommunication was issued first unofficial, then formal. But Savonarola's following only grew. His words became more apocalyptic, his visions more extreme. He described Florence as surrounded by angels. He warned that a second flood would come if the people wavered. And then came the plague. It spread in the poorer districts, killing dozens in days. Many fled the city, others locked themselves inside. The skies grew gray with smoke from the endless burnings and from funerals. Amid the sickness, people turned not to medicine or prayer, but to Savonarola's pulpit, where he now spoke of divine punishment and cleansing fire. But not everyone listened. A growing faction, the arrabbiati, or the enraged ones, began to push back. These were nobles and merchants who saw their influence fading under the friar's reign. They despised the bonfire culture, the child enforcers, the endless humiliation of public piety. They began to mock Savonarola in taverns, calling him the Black Mouth. Graffiti appeared overnight, drawings of him with horns or being devoured by his own sermons. And most dangerously, whispers began to circulate that perhaps the Pope was right, perhaps the friar had gone mad. For now, Savonarola still held the pulpit. But something had shifted. The flames still rose in the piazza, the children still marched. But Florence no longer looked holy, it looked haunted. The city's soul was being squeezed inch by inch under the weight of divine perfection. And in that silence, a new horror emerged, the realization that Florence was not becoming New Jerusalem. It was becoming a theocratic prison. It was no longer just heretics or humanists who feared Savonarola. It was now the Pope, and not just any Pope, but Alexander VI Borgia, a man who had turned the papacy into a fortress of nepotism, indulgence, and power. From the Vatican, Alexander had watched the Dominican friar mock his authority for years. But this wasn't just insubordination, it was contagion. If one preacher could declare a republic free from Rome's influence, others might follow. Already murmurs were rising from cities in northern Italy, even as far as Germany, that perhaps the Pope's moral authority had withered. And so Alexander resolved to make an example of Savonarola, one that would extinguish the flame before it spread. But Savonarola didn't flinch. When the first papal letter arrived in late 1495 urging him to cease preaching and report to Rome, Savonarola read it aloud in church and tore it apart with words. "Tell the Pope," he thundered, "that I fear not his thunderbolts, for I speak not my own words, but those of the Lord." The congregation roared in approval. Yet beneath that defiance, there was calculation. Savonarola was not naive. He knew that challenging Rome was dangerous, especially under a Borgia. So he doubled down on prophecy. He declared that the Antichrist had infiltrated the church, that Florence was the ark of salvation, that he, Savonarola, had been chosen to purify not just one city, but Christendom itself. He sent letters to kings and emperors, urging them to call a council to depose Alexander VI. He appealed to the Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian. He even reached out to Charles V of France, begging him to march on Rome and install a new pope. But the kings of Europe were wary of a monk who claimed to speak for God. And meanwhile, the Vatican sharpened its tools. Alexander authorized the Dominicans' own superiors to silence Savonarola. Orders came down through the Dominican chain of command, forbidding him from preaching. When he defied them, the Pope excommunicated him formally in May 1497. The charge is disobedience, heresy, and perhaps most damning, schism. Savonarola's response was theatrical. He refused the document. He claimed it was forged. Then, after a dramatic pause in preaching, he returned to the pulpit under cover of obedience to God, not man. His sermons shifted tone again. Now they were filled with fire and revenge. He no longer spoke of Florence's salvation, but of divine wrath to come against Rome, against priests, against all who betrayed Christ's mission. His voice cracked in rage as he described angels sharpening swords and demons surrounding the Vatican. But the city began to grow nervous. Church bells now rang with unease. Markets quieted. Foreign merchants stopped arriving. The Medici family, still exiled, began to reassert influence from afar, whispering through allies that the friar had led Florence to ruin. And inside the government, more members of the Signoria began to resent Savonarola's interference. Papal agents made contact with the arrabbiati opposition. Coins were exchanged, promises made. Rome's plan was no longer just spiritual, it was political. And then in one of history's cruel ironies, a scandal handed the Pope a weapon. A man named Francesco Valori, a key ally of Savonarola, had begun purging political opponents with a fervor that mirrored the friar's religious zeal. Arrests, torture, even executions were carried out in the name of cleansing the Republic. Florence had not become a beacon of holiness. It had become a paranoid, bleeding theocracy. Moderates turned against him. The balance began to tip. Sensing the shift, Alexander made one final move. He issued a public warning that any city harboring a heretic risked interdict, a full ban on sacraments. No weddings, no baptisms, no masses, a spiritual quarantine. For a deeply religious city like Florence, this was a death sentence. Already reeling from plague and political instability, the fear of spiritual abandonment cracked the walls of loyalty. Suddenly, even Savonarola's allies hesitated. Merchants whispered about fleeing. Artists cursed the lack of commissions. Mothers wept, unsure if their children would be baptized. And still Savonarola did not yield. "If I must suffer," he told his monks, "then I suffer as Christ suffered, abandoned by the people he came to save." But this time there was no prophecy to save him. No divine wind. No invasion to shift fate. Florence stood on the brink not of glory, but collapse. And in the quiet corridors of San Marco, Savonarola began to sense that the tide was not just turning, it was preparing to drown him. The bells of Florence still tolled, but now they seemed funereal, not for the death of a man, but for the death of conviction. By early 1498, something had shifted in the city's pulse. The air was still thick with incense and public prayer, the children's patrols still marched, and the churches remained full, but the fervor had turned brittle. A once radiant belief in divine purpose now flickered behind wary eyes. Faith was no longer inspiration, it was obligation, and Savonarola had become tired. Those closest to him noticed it first. His once soaring sermons now stumbled. His visions came less frequently. The fire in his eyes had not gone out, but it had dimmed. His health, already fragile, declined. He grew gaunt, his voice rasped. He spent hours in silent meditation, staring at the floor of his cell, lips moving in confession to no one. He began to speak more of martyrdom, but Florence had problems of its own. The city was fracturing. Factions that once united under his banner were now turning against each other. Even among the Piagnoni, his weeping followers' disagreements erupted. Some still saw him as a prophet. Others feared he had become a fanatic. The government newly reshuffled was no longer friendly. The Signoria had grown weary of his interference in civic affairs. They quietly halted some of his puritanical reforms. Gambling and taverns reappeared. Markets reopened on feast days. A slow secular rebellion took root not through violence but through apathy. Yet it was Savonarola himself who pushed things too far. In March 1498, as the pressure from Rome mounted and his base began to crumble, he made a final gamble, one that reeked of desperation cloaked in faith. He challenged his critics to a trial by fire. It was an ancient, near-mythical ordeal. Two men would walk through a wall of flame. God would protect the righteous. It had not been practiced in centuries, even the church had abandoned it. But Savonarola believed it would silence his enemies, galvanize the people, and prove once and for all that his mission was divinely ordained. He would not walk through the fire himself. Instead, his supporter, a monk named Fra Domenico, would do so on his behalf. The opposition nominated a Franciscan friar to oppose him. The date was set April 7th, 1498. From dawn, the Piazza della Signoria filled with thousands. The spectacle was intoxicating, part holy theater, part death wish. A massive corridor of flame fueled by oil and pitch was constructed in the square. The city held its breath. But then, delay. First there were arguments over the garments the monks would wear, wool or linen. Was one more flammable than the other? Then came disputes over whether they could carry crucifixes. Hours passed. The sky darkened. Then thunder. A sudden downpour soaked the square. The fire was extinguished before a single foot crossed the line. No miracle, no martyrdom, just rain and silence. It was the worst possible outcome. Not drama, not triumph, but humiliation. The crowd, once reverent, now muttered and jeered. Some shouted curses, others laughed. When Fra Domenico tried to speak, he was pelted with stones. That night, Florence changed. People who had feared to question now spoke openly. Shopkeepers mocked the friar. Children kicked down penitential banners. The term piagnone became a slur. It wasn't just Savonarola who had failed, it was the illusion that he had ever been chosen by God. Within days, the Signoria moved. They issued a decree banning Savonarola from preaching. When he ignored it, they demanded he appear before the council. When he refused, they sent soldiers. The gates of the convent of San Marco were barred. Inside, monks panicked. Some begged him to flee. Others knelt in prayer. But Savonarola remained calm. He believed this was his Calvary, his passion. He took confession. He wept. He wrote a final letter to the faithful. But outside, the mood was not holy. A mob had gathered. Angry, betrayed, hungry. They smashed the convent gates with axes. As the soldiers flooded in, some monks tried to resist. Others surrendered immediately. Savonarola was found in his chamber, unarmed, surrounded by candles. He whispered, "I am ready." But he was not ready for what came next. It was supposed to be divine theater, a reckoning of prophets, a final confirmation from heaven itself. Instead, it became farce and worse evidence of human fraud. April 7th, 1498, was the day Florence held its breath. The entire city gathered in the Piazza della Signoria not for justice, but for a spectacle. The air smelled of oil and anticipation. A long corridor of dry wood and kindling stretched across the square, flanked by walls of flame-retardant soldiers and packed crowds, pressing forward like a single heaving organism. In one corner stood Fra Domenico da Pescia, devoted follower of Savonarola, calm-faced and prayerful. Across from him stood Fra Francesco da Puglia, the Franciscan challenger, cloaked in silence and surrounded by his skeptical brethren. And in the background above it all, Savonarola watched from the steps of the Palazzo Vecchio, his hands trembling within his sleeves. But something was different this time. The crowd wasn't united in reverence anymore. People had come not just to believe, but to see. Doubt had crept into the public. Whispers had spread for weeks. Was Savonarola truly a prophet? Or had he simply manipulated fear? The ordeal was meant to prove it. Yet from the start, the trial unraveled. First came the dispute over what the monks would wear. The Dominicans insisted Fra Domenico be allowed to wear his wool habit, despite the risk of it catching fire quickly. The Franciscans objected. Then came argument over whether each monk could carry a crucifix or a holy relic for divine protection. That too descended into legalistic squabbling. Hours passed. The sun shifted. The crowds grew restless. Jeers began to rise. Someone threw a cabbage. A dead rat landed near the firewood. Then the sky changed. Black clouds rolled over the rooftops, sudden and theatrical, as if the heavens themselves were disgusted. Thunder cracked, rain poured. The flames, painstakingly prepared, hissed and died in minutes. No fire, no ordeal. No miracle, only mud. The two friars never took a step. The crowd's silence turned quickly. Some screamed, others laughed not nervously but bitterly. "Where is your God?" Now shouted one voice. "Where is your prophet?" cried another. Stones were thrown at both groups. Several monks had to be escorted away under armed guard. In that moment, the spell broke. Florence had lived for years under a shared delusion that its suffering had meaning, that its hardships were ordained, that its self-denial would bring divine favor. But when the fire refused to burn, the people saw not a test, not a mystery, but a man who could not deliver. Savonarola returned to the convent of San Marco in silence. The next day, the Signoria, once filled with his allies, voted to strip him of his protections. Armed soldiers surrounded the monastery. The same monks who had once defended him to the death now sat quietly in their cells. A few slipped away before nightfall. One was later seen handing papers to city guards. Inside, Savonarola wrote, he penned letters to the kings of Europe. He sent messages to his few remaining supporters, urging peace and faith. He begged for time, but time was the one thing he no longer had. On April 8th, an angry mob broke down the convent doors. They looted the altars, smashed statues, and dragged monks out into the street. In the chaos, 3 key figures were seized, Savonarola, Fra Domenico, and Fra Silvestro, the inner circle of the so-called Prophets movement. They were taken not to a monastery or tribunal. They were taken to the Bargello, the city's prison and torture chamber. As the iron gates closed behind him, Savonarola said only one sentence. "The Lord has called me to drink the cup of his passion." But the cup that awaited him would not be swift. It would be metal, it would be rope, and it would be slow. The Bargello was cold even in April. Its walls, ancient and damp, bore centuries of screams. Down its stone corridors behind an iron door bolted 3 times, Girolamo Savonarola was shackled to a wooden bench. The friar who had once thundered prophecies from the pulpit now sat silent pale, his robes torn and smeared with grime. The chains cut into his wrists. But he didn't speak. Not yet. The Signoria had no interest in theological arguments. They wanted a confession, public, humiliating, and complete. To secure it, they turned to an old Florentine ritual, la corda, the rope. It began not with violence, but with voices. One by one, the interrogators entered not guards, but city officials and clerics, some of whom had once stood beside Savonarola in prayer. They asked questions softly, at first calling him fratello. They offered mercy if he would confess to false prophecy, to heresy, to inventing his visions. Savonarola refused. The rope came out. His hands were bound behind his back, a noose tied around his wrists. Then, slowly, methodically, they hoisted his body into the air, suspending him by the arms behind his back. A dislocation torture. His shoulders tore, ligaments snapped. He bit down on his own tongue to avoid screaming. He was lowered. They asked again, "Did you lie about hearing God? Did you invent the visions?" Silence. They hoisted him again. Then again. Over and over. No blood, no spectacle. Just the dull crack of bone and the whispered prayers of men watching their prophet collapse into flesh. After 3 days, Savonarola broke. But what spilled onto the page was not clarity, it was chaos. Under duress, he confessed to having deceived the people, but then retracted the confession the next day. In total, he wrote 4 different statements. Each one changed, each one bore the tremor of broken hands. Witnesses claimed that by the second confession he could no longer hold the pen, only scrawl marks guided by a guard's hand. At one point he reportedly whispered, "They ask if I am a prophet. I am not. I am but a voice, and it has fallen silent." Worse than the pain was the betrayal. Fra Silvestro, one of his closest companions, cracked almost immediately. Under far lighter torture, he denounced Savonarola as a deceiver, claimed the visions were fabricated, and offered detailed accounts of secret manipulations inside the monastery. Fra Domenico, the loyal firewalker, held out longer, but eventually admitted to sharing in the deception out of loyalty, not belief. The trial held publicly was a farce. The transcripts still preserved today read more like theater than law. Judges interrupted, witnesses contradicted, confessions extracted under torture were read as gospel. The crowd outside cheered whenever the friar's voice cracked. When Savonarola tried to defend himself, he was shouted down. One moment stands out in the record. When asked why he had opposed the Pope, he replied, "Because the Pope does not walk with Christ, because his throne is built on lust and gold." For this they spat in his face. But even now, not all were convinced of his guilt. A few Florentines, especially women, still prayed for him in secret. Some wept outside the prison walls. One baker left fresh bread at the gates each morning, a final flicker of loyalty in a city that had turned its back. Inside, the Bargello Savonarola was falling apart. He had not eaten in days. Infection set into his shoulders. His skin turned yellow. One witness claimed that when he was brought to his second hearing, he fainted from the stench of his own wounds. The man who once claimed to speak for God now looked more corpse than cleric. But the executioners were not finished. They wanted a final public confession to be read aloud in the square before his death, and they wanted it in his own handwriting. They broke 2 fingers a day until he could no longer resist. The final document was signed in a jagged scrawl, barely legible beneath the declaration that he had erred grievously in speaking against the Holy Father. The script bore signs of muscle tremors, as though the hand had been forced to move against the will. Florence had its confession. But in the silence that followed, a new fear arose, not from Savonarola's fire, but from what came next. Because when a man's soul is broken publicly, completely methodically, what remains for a city to believe in, they did not want him to die quickly. Girolamo Savonarola had become more than a prisoner. He was now a message. His broken body paraded before Florence would serve as a warning to prophets, rebels, and any man who dared place divine authority above the church or the state. The torture did not end with confession, it evolved. The goal was not just to extract, but to degrade. The church sent new interrogators, men from the Holy Office, trained not just in scripture, but in anatomy. They knew where to place the cords, how to twist the joints, how to extract screams without blood. Every act was methodical, cloaked in prayer. For 33 days, one for each year of Christ's life, Savonarola was subjected to a cycle of torment. The strappado was used most frequently, arms bound behind the back, hoisted by a rope, then dropped not enough to kill, but enough to tear ligaments from sockets. They dislocated his shoulders again and again. His arms hung limp and useless by the second week. At one point, a friar witnessed the session and later wrote that Savonarola's shoulder hung like a rag from his frame, and yet his mouth refused Latin prayer. But it wasn't just physical. They alternated torture with ritual confessions, forced prayers, and read aloud psalms. They made him listen to sermons about obedience. They quoted scripture, then applied the rope. When he passed out, they revived him with vinegar and slapped him awake. His feet were crushed flat to prevent escape. He was kept in darkness for days, then dragged into blazing torchlight. One morning they forced him to watch the torture of Fra Domenico, not just to punish, but to shatter the spirit that remained. On the 24th day, Savonarola tried to speak, and produced only a rasp. A notary leaned closer and transcribed, "I was once a voice. Now I am silence." And yet even in this state they demanded more. They ordered him to write a final sermon to be read before his execution. A last renunciation. A declaration that he had lied in all things. He was given ink parchment and a splint to bind to his fingers. What he produced was barely readable, a mixture of verses, personal laments, and half-coherent pleas. But it was enough. The state had its paper. Outside preparations began. The Signoria announced that Savonarola, Fra Domenico, and Fra Silvestro would be executed on May 23rd. The method would be both symbolic and absolute, first hanged, then burned. A dual death to destroy both body and legacy. In secret, some citizens begged for mercy. Others hoped for a pardon from Rome. But none came. Alexander the Second, far from relenting, ordered envoys to witness the execution personally. The final days were spent in total isolation. Savonarola was denied visits. Even food was reduced to a crust of bread and water. He no longer spoke. He simply prayed silently until his lips bled. When he was told the date of his death, he reportedly nodded and said, "It is time to ascend the pyre." He requested the Eucharist. The priest hesitated. A man under excommunication should not receive it. But the guards relented. In that moment, Savonarola wept, not from fear, but from the return of something long absent grace. The morning of the execution, he was dressed in the robes of a friar, now torn, burned, and re-sewn. They cut a hole through the back to allow the ropes to pass through more easily. His hands were bound with black cord. He had to be carried to the cart. His legs no longer moved. The city buzzed with anticipation. Thousands poured into the Piazza della Signoria. Children were lifted onto shoulders. Foreign dignitaries stood near the front. Merchants closed their shops for the day. It was as if Florence had scheduled a public unmaking of its soul. A raised scaffold had been constructed with 3 nooses. Below it, a pile of dry wood, pitch, and sulfur. The flames would be high and fast, but only after the bodies hung long enough for the crowd to see them twist. Before mounting the scaffold, Savonarola was asked, "Do you still believe you were God's prophet?" He looked to the sky and answered, "I believe I was what Florence needed, and now what it must forget." They placed the noose around his neck. The friar, who had once claimed to speak for God, was now silent still and waiting. May 23rd, 1988. The morning broke warm and clear, as if the sky itself refused to acknowledge what was about to take place. In the heart of Florence, the Piazza della Signoria had been transformed into a theater of death. Thousands packed the square, from rag-cloaked peasants to silk-draped merchants. Children perched atop barrels and balconies. Foreign emissaries stood in hushed groups, watching not with outrage but with curiosity. And there above it all, the scaffold loomed, stark wooden and final. At its center stood 3 nooses. Savonarola was the last to be brought forward. His body sagged between 2 guards, too broken to stand on his own. His face was swollen, yellowed from weeks of torture. His robe hung like burial cloth. As he was lifted onto the platform, some in the crowd jeered, others remained silent. The silence was louder. Beside him stood Fra Domenico and Fra Silvestro, both pale, trembling. Neither spoke. The executioner approached cross in hand, but Savonarola turned away. He looked out at the crowd, eyes unfocused, searching, or perhaps simply seeing for the last time. A papal emissary stepped forward and read aloud the charges: heresy, schism, false prophecy, sedition. The words fell like stones into water. No ripples, no reaction. Florence had already heard them. Then came the formal degradation. A Dominican official stepped forward, stripped the friars of their religious status, and declared them cut off from the church like withered branches from the vine of Christ. The gesture was symbolic, but also deeply psychological. They were not just being executed, they were being erased. The ropes were fastened, a pause long deliberate, and then the drop. Their bodies jerked, limbs spasmed briefly. The crowd didn't cheer. A heavy, loaded quiet fell over the piazza, not reverence but discomfort. No one knew whether to look or to look away. But the death was not yet complete. The scaffold was designed to pivot forward, allowing the bodies to drop directly into the pyre below. As the nooses tightened, the wood beneath them creaked, tilted, and the 3 figures fell together into a nest of dried timber, pitch, and oil. A torch was applied. The fire rose with a violent roar. Flames consumed the ropes, first sending the corpses tumbling further into the blaze. In seconds, the robes ignited, then the skin, then the bones. The friars men once feared as prophets became silhouettes of crackling black. Eyewitnesses described the smell acrid, oily, unforgettable. One chronicler, Luca Landucci, wrote, "The flame danced upon their bodies, but the people did not cheer. Some crossed themselves, others turned away. It was not triumph, it was something colder." To prevent any veneration of remains, the authorities ordered the ashes scattered in the Arno. No relics, no martyrdom, no shrine. Just dust carried away by indifferent water. But Florence itself remained behind. The city that had once bowed to Savonarola now faced a vacuum, not just of power, but of identity. The moral order he had imposed had been shattered, yet nothing rushed in to fill its place. The Republic limped on, plagued by infighting, corruption, and the slow return of Medici influence. The bonfires of the Vanities were never held again. The child patrols vanished. The sermons returned to orthodoxy. But the wound of faith, weaponized of fear, dressed as righteousness, remained beneath the marble beauty of the city. In the weeks that followed, a few dared to speak of him fondly. Quiet prayers were whispered at San Marco. A widow was seen kneeling at the spot of the pyre. Children passed stories of the friar who had spoken to angels, but history had already begun the forgetting. And yet beneath the ash and the silence, something lingered, a question that would rise again in centuries to come. What happens when a man believes he speaks for God, and the crowd believes him until it doesn't? In the centuries that followed, Girolamo Savonarola would be remembered, but never comfortably. To some, he was a madman, a zealot who hijacked a republic and drowned a renaissance in fear and flames. To others, he was a martyr, a saint before his time, silenced for speaking against a corrupt church decades before Luther would nail his theses to a door. But perhaps the most unsettling truth is this: he was both. Savonarola revealed something terrifying about the human soul, how easily fear can masquerade as faith, how purity can be demanded at the point of a sermon, how a city can willingly erase its joy in exchange for the illusion of holiness. Florence was not forced into obedience. It chose it. It welcomed the fires. It sang the hymns. It turned its children into inquisitors. And then, when the fire no longer gave light, it turned. His death did not stop the tide of reform. Within a few decades, Protestantism would explode across Europe. Corruption in the Vatican would be exposed in far more brutal terms. The same popes who condemned Savonarola would later canonize lesser men for lesser struggles. In 1997, 500 years after his death, Pope John Paul II formally acknowledged the tragic nature of Savonarola's execution, referring to him as a man of faith. No pardon, no sainthood. But perhaps a flicker of recognition. The real legacy of Savonarola is not in flames or ash, but in the haunting knowledge that belief once weaponized can consume even the devout. That truth, when claimed too absolutely, becomes indistinguishable from tyranny. And that sometimes the most dangerous thing in a city is not sin, but the man who believes he can cleanse it.